We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to the latest Planet Hoyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by Planet Hoyrood regular Douglas Dickie of the Scottish Daily Express, and we've got a podcast newbie, our head of news at the Daily Record, Mark Smith, aka Smitty. Welcome. I'm trying to think how I would describe your politics, Mark. Probably to the left of communism, something like that?
About there, yeah.
Stalin was a sellout, that sort of thing?
All of that, maybe. Certainly to the left of Farage.
Certainly to the... Oh, okay. Daily Record mainstream, anyway.
Yeah.
So, look, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, just sat down after delivering her first spending review in the job. It's not as important as the budget, but it's probably crucial in terms of Labour's re-election hopes and setting out all the spending plans for the Whitehall departments and broadly setting out what the Scottish Parliament's got to spend over the next few years as well. Before we talk about the sort of nuts and bolts of it, let's just listen to the Chancellor talk about our spending review.
Backing our nations and regions means backing our devolved governments. And this spending review provides the largest settlement in real terms since devolution was introduced, with £52 billion for Scotland, £20 billion for Northern Ireland by the end of the spending review, and £23 billion for Wales. And because I am determined to make sure that the energy technologies of the future are built here and owned here, and that those jobs come to Britain, with spending review decisions means that we can invest in the wholly publicly owned Great British Energy. Great British Energy, headquartered in Scotland. These are investments to make sure the towns and cities which powered the last industrial revolution will play their part in our next industrial revolution, with £11 billion increased in defence spending and a £600 million uplift for our security and intelligence agencies. That investment will deliver not only security, but also renewal. In Aldermaston and Lincoln, in Portsmouth and Filton, on the Clyde and in Rosyth, investment in Scotland, jobs in Scotland, defence for the United Kingdom, opposed by the Scottish National Party, delivered by this Labour government.
So the Chancellor mentioned Scotland quite a lot. It's almost like there's a Scottish Parliament election on the horizon and the Labour government are desperate for an Ass Sarwar to win it. So I'll just go through some of the headline numbers. This is for England, 39 billion for affordable and social housing. That will mean billions given to the Scottish Parliament in consequentials for housing. Day-to-day spending will rise in the NHS by 3% per year. Every year the spending review, again, a lot of money is going to be kicked up north of the border. And I think that by the end of the spending review period, the Scottish Government will have an extra £9.1 billion to play with. So you can take a lot of kids out of poverty with that. You can build a lot of homes if you spend it correctly. So, I mean, Mark, I don't know what your thought is, but you know, the Labour government had a bit of a troubled start with the winter fuel, WASPy, welfare cuts, but I just sense that over the last month they've started to get their act together with trade deals, the spending review when it came to defence, and now this. It just feels like this might be a bit of a turning point for them.
I hope so. Cards on the table. The winter fuel debacle was terrible for Labour.
Yeah.
Shocking. They didn't read the room. They misunderstood the mood of the electorate. An absolutely disastrous decision for them to do that. And I don't think even they realise how much damage that did. Certainly for record readers it was a big issue. I think we rightly criticised them for that. This today, to me, is the start of the comeback for Labour. They're doing the right things, they're putting money into the right areas, particularly housing. One of those thorny issues where it's sometimes difficult to engage the voters. We all know we're in the middle of a housing crisis. The Record's led the way on that as well as we do on most things. Homelessness is up. There is a lack of affordable housing all throughout the UK. Putting money into that is spectacularly good, I think, for Labour. And I tell you what, that gives the SNP a right headache because they've dropped the ball on that, and they have done for years. So there's the money, John. What are you going to do with it? So I'm looking forward to hearing how the SNP react.
Seems like a good day for Labour.
Well, you know, the proof will be in the detail, Paul. It's very good in the headlines, but you know, the main question I think voters will want to know is who's going to be paying for this, and the simple answer to that is I think it's going to be the taxpayer who
I hope so.
pays for it, and you know, Rachel Reeves is going to be dipping into your pocket to pay for it. Smitty's happy with that.
I think
obviously
she's protecting working
But
people.
she's-
No rises in income tax, no rises in employee NI.
Yeah, at the moment, but give it, you know, a year. This all needs to be paid for, and I think that's, you know, that's where she's going to be going. It's for me, this represents a bit of a humiliating U-turn for Labour today. You know, she kind of presented herself as the Tories said, she presented herself as the Iron Chancellor, and she's turned it to be the tinfoil Chancellor.
Look,
So
what she said was that some tough decisions early doors start to turn the economy around, and then you'd get some Labour policies, particularly on public spending. I think she's come good. I mean, the winter fuel, as Smitty says, was a complete and utter disaster. That was the wrong decision to make, but you know, they learnt their lesson on that, and I think what they announced this week on winter fuel was a lot better. Anyone who earns less than 35 grand is going to get their winter fuel payment, and folk like Elton John and all these folk are just going to have
we
to
always use
make
Elton
do
John
without
as an
it.
example, don't we? It's always, you know, poor Elton, what's he done to
Shows
kind of
our age. Shows our
deserve
age.
this? But
See, on tax, people should love paying tax because it's good for society, good for communities. See, this idea that low tax is good for everyone, it's a nightmare.
it's
The
good.
super rich get tax breaks all over the place. That's money going to the Bahamas that should be getting spent here.
It's
so
good.
tax is great. So
It's
let's drop
good.
that idea that tax is some sort of terrible thing that everyone hates.
It's good
Folk
if
should
people.
love paying tax.
It's good if people are getting bang for their buck on it, but right now we're not.
Got to be spent wisely. Got to be spent wisely.
You know, public services are, for want of a better word, crap. You know, all over the UK, we're already a really highly taxed country, and people don't see the benefit of that. And now it feels like we are now going to have to pay for Rachel Reeves' awful first year in charge.
Well, I mean, her
I
awful
don't
first
think
year
she'll
was
be-
about cleaning up the Tory mess.
I don't think she's going to be, you know, she's. But you know, things were already improving towards the end of that kind of Tory reign. I think.
Were they? I must have missed that. I must have missed that.
I think this is
Did I fall asleep?
That burning building, I think it's a wee bit better.
I can't remember that.
I think
Must
Rishi
have slipped.
Sunak could get a grip off it. Events in politics, as we know, can take over. I think a Labour victory was pretty inevitable.
I remember during
last
that
year.
election campaign, folk were thinking, gee, folk, it's getting a lot better. Thank God for Sunak. Folk thought it was a disaster, and he'd managed to maybe, you know, prove it marginally, but you know, the whole country was a bin fire, and it was thanks to folk like Johnson, Truss, and Sunak himself.
Reeves has done, to my mind, a pretty sterling job to try to rein it back in. We all know the winter fuel thing was badly handled, but she had an absolute nightmare to deal with thanks to the Tories and all their disastrous years in charge. What she's wanting to do now is shift that tax burden onto those that can afford it and make sure that that money is properly spent on things that will make our lives better, everybody's lives better. Now, nobody can say that's a bad thing, but you're right. Too many poor people are paying too much tax. But what Labour and the Tories and the SNP need to get their head round is we need more tax take from the rich. And that's where I think Labour are going to get it right. They're going to shift that tax burden eventually to those that can best afford it. That's the way to do it. And that's the way to get
There's
society
still
back.
tax to be rated. Capital gains is pretty low. The council tax is a complete and utter disgrace.
Yeah.
You know, it's so regressive. You know, if there was a political will to raise more money from the wealthy, you know, you could do it in a way that wouldn't damage incentives.
I think Blair and Brown did it. They didn't get much credit for it, but Blair and Brown actually shifted the tax burden in this country very much to the wealthy. And they managed to distribute a lot of wealth. They had to keep quiet about it so that the Express and the Mail would give them an easy time. But they did a great job there. I think Reeves is trying to pull a similar trick, try to pull the wool over the eyes of the right-wing press, but still get that money in there and still make public services better. And I can't wait for this. I can't wait for the pips to squeak among the rich.
Well, we won't be fooled, Mark. I can tell you that she won't be pulling the wool over the Express's eyes. But I think there's a lesson to be learned from Scotland for Rachel Reeves as well. You know, Humza Yousaf hiked tax and it done absolutely nothing. You know, hiking tax isn't the answer to everything, but it's going to need to be the answer to this. And you know, who is it that pays? I think it's probably going to be your kind of middle earners, because we know that high earners just up sticks and leave if they get taxed too much. There's already warnings about that today, you know, immediately after this. And you know, as I said earlier, the proof in this spending review is going to be in the detail.
How do you pay? How do you solve the housing crisis without money? It's okay to say, well, we should cut tax, cut public spending, shrink the state. That we live in a housing disaster. Our kids can't afford to pay rent, never mind buy a house. How do you solve that without public resources? Labour are trying to get money into that public sector so that we can actually solve the housing crisis. It's a market failure. The state needs to step in there and it needs to do something to get the housing market moving, to get houses built. You can't do that by cutting tax, and you never will. So you can't say on the one hand, it's a crisis, let's do something about it, but let's not spend any money. We need money spent on housing. It's a key thing for, I think, a lot of people out there. Got to be sorted. I think Reeves has got the right idea on that front. I know you'll maybe not agree with most of that, but that's definitely what needs to be done.
You mentioned the SNP, Dougie. I mean, I think that from a Labour perspective, I think they see this coming election. The dividing line is now that the Scottish Parliament is getting 9.1 billion extra, and the question for Labour that they pose will be, who is better spending this money? Is it going to be an incoming Scottish Labour government, or is it going to be a tired SNP government that's been in for 18 years, blown all sorts of money on ferries that were, never built, an NHS that's on its knees, that have completely failed? I think it's quite a good line from them, and I think, I know that they're about 13 points behind in the polls just now in Scotland, but this does feel like a bit of a watershed on a number of levels for Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult one for the SNP. I don't really know where they kind of go politically. Parking the kind of arguments over tax and who pays for it. The simple fact is they're going to get more money. It's up to them how they pay for it. You said earlier that billions of pounds in Barnett consequentials for housing. The SNP don't need to use it for housing. They can use it for whatever they want. And in the past few years, they've had to use it on whopping great public sector salary pays for people, rather than it going into going to help the people who need it the most. So I think the SNP are a real fankle with it. Their response will probably be, this is yet another reason for independence, because everything is a reason for independence. But I think it puts them, it puts John Swinney on the back foot.
I think, with the SNP, they're getting the money. Not only do they have to spend it on housing, but they have to actually deliver better outcomes for people. It can't just be, wasting more.
No doubt about it. There is an argument to be made for increased spending on public services, increased taxation. The caveat is it has to be spent properly. Now, the SNP have been poor on service delivery. In fact, that's being kind. They've been shocking on service delivery. Most people have got experience at the health service. Great people work there and it does amazing stuff. But it's in crisis all over the place. The SNP have failed to deliver the improvements that we all thought devolution would deliver. This 9 billion that's going to come towards the government in Scotland, they need to get it right when it comes to service delivery, or people will say, why the hell are we paying more money for services that are not up to scratch? So the ball is in Swinney's court. He has got to get a grip of Scottish public services. If he fails to do that, Labour, I think, will have a great story to tell come the next election. They'll say, Farage, Swinney, two cheeks of the same arse. We are the party that will actually improve public services and ditch all this identity politics. That is a story, a narrative that Labour can tell the voters at the next election. I think that could be good for them. Whether they close that 13-point gap, no.
I think my concern about the 9.1 billion, our splash earlier this week, Smitty, about Swinney apparently considering another council tax freeze, that he diverts money away from housing, child poverty, NHS, schools, and just gives another handout to the rich.
It's bizarre to me that in the SNP's whole time in power, how many years is it now?
18.
18 feels longer. Right. By the way, the SNP have done a lot of good stuff, by the way. I don't think we should be too critical of them. They've done a lot of good things. But on the council tax, why has that not been reformed so that people in £2 million houses pay top whack? People in 300 grand houses pay the same as people in £2 million houses. It's crazy. Reform the council tax, get those bands higher, get money into public services, and again, let the people who have the deepest pockets put money into public services. By failing to reform the council tax and instead potentially going for another council tax freeze, they are walking into a bear trap.
I know, it's like we've basically kept a system that was introduced by Michael Heseltine in the early 90s. And, you know, I mean, I know that you probably like Heseltine, but it's a wee bit strange that we get a Scottish Parliament that's supposed to tailor Scottish solutions to Scottish problems, but we keep in place this terribly regressive system.
Why have they not reformed it? I mean,
yeah, I'm not going to disagree with Smitty on that one. We shouldn't be talking about freezing the council tax or raising the council tax. We should be scrapping it and bringing in something else. I'm not going to kind of argue with that. But one thing I would say is, you know, in terms of tax, people should like paying tax. It should go to public services. Right now, there's so much waste, especially in Scotland. It feels there's so much waste on it. You know, we waste money in these equality czars and, you know, diversity training and things like that. You know, this is money that could be better spent on frontline services. And for me,
minuscule amounts of money.
That's where
minuscle. People on the right
on
have to bang
individual on
minuscule
individual you know, individual instances, but all added up across the board. I reckon there's savings to be made there, or money that can go.
Sound like Elon Musk.
Well, you know, maybe McDoge. You know, that should be Labour's pledge to the electorate.
Well, speaking of reform, because that's reform's agenda, I'd just like to contrast Labour's spending review with some of the things that reform have been promising voters. Because let's just imagine that the next general election is going to be Labour versus reform, rather than Labour versus Tories, who I think are going to end up in a museum somewhere. So basically, reform are wanting to increase the income tax personal allowance to 20 grand a year from its current level of 12,570. I think the IFS have estimated that will cost between 50 to 80 billion a year. They also want to reinstate the winter fuel allowance in full and have a more generous transferable marriage tax allowance. I mean, this makes Liz Truss look like Scrooge.
Let's be clear, right? Farage is a far-right loon. He will say anything to try and attract working-class voters, right? Don't get mugged off by this absolute Chancellor. If you're a working-class person, he is lying to you. He will say anything to get your vote. He is not going to govern in your interests. He's going to govern in the interests of his rich pals. That's what far-right people always do. He will try and create division. He will try and get us all blaming the poor asylum seeker who lives up the stairs in the tower block. Farage will do anything to get elected. This spending plan, if you want to give it that title, because it's nothing more than a bunch of nonsense. This spending plan is nothing more than blethers, and it's to get working class people to vote against their own self-interest and vote for a right-wing demagogue who will absolutely destroy workers' rights. He will destroy this country if he's in charge. If you believe a word of that, you're a mug.
Hold on a second. Farage went to a private school and he's a former city trader. Are you denying that he's got the interests of working class people at heart?
Oh, call me an old cynic, but yeah, I don't think he has the interests of Scottish working class people at heart. Now, obviously, the Express loves Farage.
Well, actually, the Express view is that reform are minor threat to the union.
Did you not back them in that Hamilton by-election?
We backed them in keeping with our policy of always backing the tactical vote that would get rid of the SNP, which is the major thing.
Always backing?
Always.
What if it was the BNP?
Well, okay, we would maybe review. I mean, the BNP barely exists as a party anymore, but of the mainstream...
Where is the line? Where is the line?
Parties, well, you know... I'll let Ben decide that. That's a bit above my pay grade.
Lib Dem Ben.
But the simple fact is, you know, almost a third of voters in Hamilton obviously quite liked, you know, what Farage was presenting to them. People like the idea of more money in their pocket. At the end of the day, that's how you get the economy moving. You give people more money in their pocket, more spending power.
There's no doubt people were convinced by the Farage nonsense. I think people are slowly be convincing themselves that Farage would actually be good for them, put money in their pockets, etc. It's rubbish. He is just saying whatever it will take to get elected, and then we'll see what it is. He's Margaret Thatcher on steroids, right? He is going to take our economy, shrink the state, and destroy public services.
And then run.
Yeah, he doesn't care. He's, by that time, tax cuts for his rich pals. That's his game. Anyone who believes it is getting mugged off.
I make a distinction between reform, Farage, which are dodgy, and people who are voting reform, who are angry.
Absolutely. See the scunner factor that you had in Hamilton. I get it. I think they're entirely right to be scunnered because too much of politics is not honest, and it doesn't do enough for ordinary people. Unless Labour and the SNP can sort that out, the door is open for Farage. And you're absolutely right. It's no the fault of voters, but people have to be aware of what he really is.
So if the next general was a two-horse race between Reform and Labour, who do you think the Express would back?
Well, again, that's a bit of my pay grade, Paul. Does end of a turquoise tie?
Look, there's no doubt they are a fixture of politics now, and it looks like they're going to do well, but careful what you wish for. I mean, there's so many cranks in that party.
They are in a very good position. Similar to, I always find when we come to a general election, the SNP are in a similar position. They can promise anything they want to everyone, aware that they don't have to deliver. Now, Reform may need to deliver, and I think their biggest issue right now might be seeing what happens in these kind of English councils that they're now running. People are going to be taking keeping an eye on that, and that might be their they've got to prove that they're capable of running public services, of governing, I suppose, obviously a much smaller scale. We've still got 4 years to go to the next general election. It's a long, long time. In the meantime, they're going to win seats in Scotland. I don't know if they'll finish second. A few people have been kind of saying that. I don't know if that level of support in Hamilton's a kind of plateau for them. I'm not sure how they kind of get more votes.
They got 26% with no ground operation. So if they do professionalise, then they could even.
Well, but I mean that's the thing. No ground operation, but then when you look under the bonnet, people might get the chance to look under the bonnet. They might feel differently about it.
The other thing about Reform, of course, is I think people sometimes assume they're going to take votes only from Labour and Tory. I think there's a big constituency out there. A lot of people.
Well, they clearly did.
Exactly. A lot of SNP voters out there. For a lot of people, the SNP is a scream of anger at how the system doesn't really work for them. And remember, the SNP are still a party of, independents supporting people who want to, create independence, to create a new society. It is in its way still a protest vote, even after all these years. And I think there might well be a transfer from SNP to Reform if the SNP didn't up their game. But I think Reform is a threat to all parties in Scotland, not just Labour and the Tories.
Well, maybe not the Lib Dems.
Who are they? Who cares?
I can think of one Lib Dem supporter who might switch to Reform. He's quite close to this podcast, but he's not here to defend himself.
Yeah. It's funny how you said that the SNP are the party of independence. The Gang of 25 might disagree.
I was going to mention this. So there was a story in the papers, one of the papers this morning. It didn't have a lot of sourcing to it, but it was important enough for the Daily Record to follow it up immediately. Basically, 25 people in the SNP seem to have got together in the wake of the Hamilton defeat for the SNP and are plotting to oust John Swinney unless he comes up with a new independent strategy within a couple of weeks. Now, clearly, the Hamilton by-election defeat was not Swinney's finest moment. There are complaints that he's gone soft on independence, but I think the idea that what the SNP needs just now is a leadership contest seems to be insanity.
Who knows? I mean, I've got an idea about who some of these 25 are. I better not say it here. But they clearly see independence as the main issue for voters. And they clearly think that the way for independence, the way for the SNP, to get back on track is to make independence that number one priority. I have to say, that's not the impression I get in the pub before the football on a Saturday. Nobody is really screaming for it at the minute. However, it's polling higher than it's polled for probably the whole time I've been in journalism. So there is a case to be made for Swinney to go all out on independence, to try and make the 2026 election an independence election, and certainly on firmer ground on that than there is with delivery of public services. So I think you might see a Swinney come out of this Hamilton debacle far stronger on independence, far stronger on maybe attacking reform rather than talking about public service delivery. And you know what? It might work.
He has to have a strategy on independence. I mean, I think that's lacking just now. I think if you're an SNP supporter, independent supporter, you're probably looking at your own party just now thinking, well, what is the plan B to a referendum? How are we actually going to get to that destination? So I think Swinney he's decided to steady the ship. He's focusing on cost of living measures like abolishing peak rail fares and reintroducing the winter fuel allowance first and scrapping the two-child benefit cap. But if you're in the SNP, you really want to know, how do we get to independence? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon had a number of Plan Bs. None of them materialised at all. So I kind of sympathise with Swinney in not leading people on. But that's no excuse for not having a strategy.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because there is no obvious strategy. What happens when London says no?
Exactly.
Now, as someone who's been an independent supporter and voted yes in the last referendum, you know, I quite like the idea of independence. I think it would be quite a good thing. I think it could help Scotland grow as a country. You know, there's a debate to be had around that. I mean, who knows if we ever will get another referendum. But the key point is for Swinney is, how does he get to that second referendum? He's got two options. He doesn't have a referendum. He declares UDI and we go like Rhodesia. You know, that's not an option. Or he manages to convince somebody in London that they should have a referendum against their own interest. How do you square that circle? I don't know, and it's a really tough one.
I feel like the Westminster government will never say yes while it remains a contested issue. So if it's like 53-47, they're not going to agree to a referendum where you're basically campaigning to change people's minds. If yes was consistently at 65-70% over a number of years, and it's clearly the settled will of the Scottish people, then I think the circumstances would be different. Mm-hmm. But we're far off that.
But then you'd have people on the right saying, we don't care.
I think the main point I'd make is that Swinney put independence front and centre at last year's general election campaign. It was line 1, page 1 in his manifesto, and they, to use the Glasgow vernacular, get humped. So I don't think people are in any way, the average voter's not interested in it. It consistently doesn't make the top 7 or 6 issues that are important to people today. The issue for me, a couple of months ago, it's probably reared its head a bit more in the last couple of months, but if you'd asked me 2 or 3 months ago, I'd have said it's dead. Mm-hmm. There's not even a debate. It's distinctly dishonest for him to make the Holyrood election about independence because the Constitution is a reserved issue. It's a dishonest tactic. And I think what we've seen, with this group of kind of obsessive extremists, if you like, who everything is independence. I don't mean that in a kind of negative.
I think extremists is...
okay. I don't... But those who put that above everything else, the solution to everything is independence. I had to laugh at Tommy Shepherd this week. Independence could stop World War III. I mean, really, like, we're in the twilight zone here.
Where I agree with you is that just because you've got opinion polls showing, say, 55-56% support for independence, doesn't mean to say there's a strength of feeling for it. If you ask someone on the street if they support independence or not, they could say yes, but it might not be in their top 10 issues. I think that if there was a feeling like it was at 60-65% and it was the number one issue for those people, then the political culture and the dynamic
do you
would change.
think a Labour or Tory Prime Minister could ever really turn around and say, yes, we will grant you this referendum? Even if it were at 65-70% opposed for independence, and by the way, it's heading that way, can any Prime Minister really, does they want to be the one that breaks up the United Kingdom?
Well,
it would be an absolute gift to their opponents. I just can't see it.
But also, I think that they're unlikely to do it because they're still scarred by the last campaign, even though no campaigners, Better Together campaigners, look back on the referendum with horror.
Yeah.
It wasn't a pleasant experience for them. They felt like it divided Scotland. They don't want to go through that again. And I think that is as much to do with hostility to Indie Ref 2 as anything else.
I think the problem is as well is the polls are still asking, as far as I'm concerned, a completely biased question. If you look at other polls that use questions like should Scotland leave the UK, or it asks you, what independence should look like, loads of people say, well, we should still share the armed forces, we should still share this. The fact is, when you actually look at, again, when you look under the bonnet, I don't think there is any groundswell for independence. It's a nice idea. Do you think Scotland should be an independent country? Oh yeah, it's an easy answer.
I think there are lots of people who want independence and want it
absolutely, absolutely. But I don't think that equates to 55%, or actually, actual support still below 50. We're taking it the don't knows, who I think historically in these kind of referendums tend to break for the status quo. They're cautious or conservative, and ultimately, I feel like we've kind of got off the subject to the fact that John Swinney is all of a sudden under pressure, barely a year in the job. Yeah. Again, he's under pressure. I thought that the Hamilton defeat was a disaster for him. Everything was there for him. I thought they couldn't possibly. I mean, I was on this show many times. The SNP will win easy. The SNP will win easy. And they completely botched it. And if they've botched that one, where everything's set up for them, what's it going to be like next year when all of a sudden it's like, well, actually, Labour have given us back the winter fuel payments and they haven't robbed my tax or pension just yet. So actually, let's look at the NHS. Let's look at housing in Scotland, and that presents a real issue for them.
Should say just a mini postscript. John Swinney had a limited reshuffle of his team this morning and this afternoon. So Mary McCallan, who is one of his closest political allies and is rumoured to be Swinney's favoured choice as successor one day, she is now the Cabinet Secretary for Housing, which is a new post. I think that underlines the fact that Swinney is taking that public service very, very, very seriously. And, it wasn't a massive reshuffle, but it was still significant.
That one appointment, to me, points to a whole new direction for the SNP and Swinney. They know where they have messed up, and I think they know what they want to do to fix it. I think you will see a lot of that extra Barnett consequential cash for the Scottish Government going into housing, going into public service delivery. And I think Swinney will go into the next election with service delivery at the heart of it, but he is going to have to keep those members on side who want independence to be front and centre. Now, he's going to have a twin-track strategy there. He's going to need to keep these independence supporting members happy, and he's going to have to really do better on service delivery. Having somebody like Mary McCallan in there as a housing minister shows me that service delivery is at the forefront of his mind.
Problem with housing, of course, is that how many houses can you build before next April? And it's going to be tough. All they can really do is make an announcement with a big number and hope that people are impressed. But I think that the average Scottish voter has heard that story before. They've listened to the SNP, particularly at their party conferences, make big announcements, grand announcements, and they never follow through. So
maybe you can have another summit, taxpayer funded, of course.
Yes, well, they do like their summits. So look, I think that pretty much covers it all. Thanks to Dougie, thanks to Smitty. I knew you'd be good.
Let the viewers decide that.
Let listeners decide. So listen, you can listen to this episode of Planet Hoyrood on Spotify or Apple Music, or you can watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast. Cheers.
Cheers.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.